Today I'm going to tell you 3 real-life horror stories from London that will make your blood run cold. The first is about 19-month-old boy who was forced to obey commands like a dog. And believe me, it was not the worst thing the boy had ever experienced. The second is about how a gangsta rapper used his image and popularity to sexual abuse minors. And finally, the third story is about the bloody revenge from a woman whose husband was killed by the police. It will be scary and no doubt interesting. These Monsters of London. London Crime Stories. On the 1st of March 2006, a baby boy was born at North Middlesex Hospital in Edmonton, North London. An ordinary baby with the big blue eyes who slept a lot at first, as newborns do. The baby was called Peter. He became the fourth child in a family that already had 3 daughters. At first glance, the parents seemed like normal people, just like the baby. They seemed to treat the baby well and were not at all bad to each other. So there was nothing to suggest that Peter's life would be inextricably linked with cruelty, violence, and ultimately tragically cut short. But it only seemed that way. Imagine how a child must have felt who was regularly malnourished, beaten, left at the mercy of large dogs who played with him as if he were a toy, forced to obey commands like an animal so he would sit when he heard a certain sound. What must a child feel whose ribs and spine have been broken and whose teeth have been knocked out by a blow to the face? What I have listed is by no means a complete account of what happened to little Peter in his 17th month of life. But in order to better understand how all this was possible and what the parents, social services and doctors were doing, spoiler alert, they also clearly what was happening. It is worth learning more about who was around the child. Peter's mother, Tracy Connolly, had a very difficult childhood to say the least. She briefly described it as shitty times. One of Tracy's few childhood friends who agreed to speak to the press told journalists, "Cruelty was all she knew. It was the norm for her." Her mother, Mary O'Connor, was pregnant 11 times but only gave birth twice. First a son, then 4 years later in 1981 a daughter, Tracy. But Mary's children had different fathers. Although O'Connor was married to a man called Gary Cox, Tracy was not his biological daughter. The girl was born because Mary, under the influence of alcohol, slept with a married family friend, Richard Johnson. Johnson himself said it was Gary who instigated it, allegedly paying Johnson £5 or just over $6 at today's exchange rate, to sleep with his wife. That's how the company joked. Was Mary O'Connor an exemplary mother? Not at all. She beat her son when he was just 6 weeks old. By the time the boy, Tracy's older brother, was 3, he had been hospitalized 4 times. Although each accident was thought to have a reasonable explanation. Mary O'Connor also had problems with alcohol and drugs. She was also convicted of intentionally stabbing her husband, although she explained her actions by saying that her husband regularly beat her and controlled her everywhere.
He was a sadist. He hit me for no reason. I couldn't go out without his permission. If I went shopping, he would count the time. I thought it was normal. When you are used to your husband beating you, you think it is normal. In the end, I stabbed him in the stomach in self-defense, but I couldn't prove it, and I got 2 years for it. But it was worth it,
says Mary O'Connor. Eventually, 2.5 years after Tracy was born, Mary O'Connor left Cox. But that did not make the girl's life any better. Mary O'Connor did not care much for her, concentrating more on her own needs and desires. People who lived near the family in the 80s and 90s, or who went to school with Tracy, recalled that after her mother's separation from Cox, she went on a drinking and drug binge. Different men kept showing up in her bed. Tracy was regularly shouted at, and neighbors sometimes saw her wandering the streets alone at night. When Tracy went to primary school, she quickly became an outcast. A childhood friend from primary school recalled, "At school she was the child nobody wanted to play with. She was overweight, dirty, and came to school in shoes that fell apart and old sweatpants. The children called her Tracy the Tramp because she was oppressed. She was always being beaten up by the other children." Mary O'Connor knew that Tracy had been bullied, but she was sure it was Tracy's own fault.
Honestly, most of the bullying was her fault. She made herself a victim. I don't know why. She was a strong girl.
Mary O'Connor said. Social workers visited the O'Connors' home on several occasions because it was clear that the family was in a difficult situation. As I said, neighbors and school staff noticed it. Eventually, due to the mother's indifference and suspicion of physical abuse, both children were removed. A place was found for 12-year-old Tracy at Fanny Close boarding school in West Sussex, which caters for children with special educational needs and behavior and social difficulties. According to her mother, Tracy did well at school. At school, however, she was described as moody and prone to getting into fight. At the age of 16, Tracy passed several exams to get her high school diploma and even managed to get a job as a hairdresser. But the career was out of the question. It wasn't something she aspired to. Instead, Tracy confided to her best friend at school that what she really wanted was
kids, a whole cohort of kids.
O'Connor claims she kept a close eye on her daughter and discouraged her from having sex with boys. But at 16, Tracy met her future husband. He was a 17-year-old railway worker. His name was never revealed. The couple had 2 daughters before they married. They officially married in 2003, and a 3rd girl was born. And in 2006, baby Peter was born, a long-awaited boy, as Connolly liked to say. Tracy's mother believed the railway man was a good man.
I didn't think much of him, but he was a good provider. She had everything she needed. He worked 3 shifts, cooked, cleaned, and washed her clothes. And he was not cruel to her,
says Mary O'Connor. But the marriage ended. There were probably several reasons for this. Tracy's husband could not stand the fact that she was extremely messy and, as he later said in court, lazy. She also drank a lot and liked to flirt. At first she did it on the internet, and later in real life, until a trivial flirtation turned into a real betrayal. It all started to go downhill when Tracy met Stephen Barker, who was renovating a friend's flat. After meeting and talking to him a few times, Barker started coming to Tracy's house, where she lived with her children and husband. Eventually, her husband lost patience. Tracy's mother explains what was happening in her daughter's home life at the time.
Can you imagine coming home to your wife after a hard day's work and seeing a man lying on your couch as if he owned the house, waiting for dinner?
Mary O'Connor. Little Peter was 3 months old when Tracy and her husband divorced. In 2006, Barker moved in with Tracy and her children. The woman seems to have lost her mind over her new flatmate. The couple often locked themselves in their bedroom for hours at a time. They had sex and the children were left to fend for themselves. Tracy also wrote about her new relationship on her social media.
It's weird when you meet someone and fall in love. You spend as much time as possible kissing, touching, and having sex. You always feel so good that you can't get enough of each other. It's wonderful.
In her diary, Connolly wrote that she finally felt her life was getting better, thanks to love, and that she wished it could last forever. Tracy about her weight and grounded at her. So what kind of person was this incredible lover Steve Barker, who had such a great sense of humor? He was born and brought up in Tottenham. Again, it was a classic story of poor family that did not like children, where parents and other relatives were addicted to drink and ignored those they had given life to. At best, they ignored them. At worst, the children became victims of violence. Stephen Barker's sister said that from an early age he was inclined to hurt others. She described her brother torturing animals, including guinea pigs and frogs. The boy would skin them alive before breaking their legs and forcing the agonized animal to move. Barker also abused people, not least those closest to him. He used to beat his relatives who were younger than him and enjoyed seeing them suffer. As he grew up, he became surprisingly sad and withdrawn. Barker's friends said it was normal for him to lock himself in his room for days at a time. Rumor has it that he was even treated for depression. But according to Stephen's friends, he preferred to treat his condition by torturing others. In addition, Barker became almost obsessed with Nazism and weapons. He collected relevant items, sometimes dressed strangely, and his conversation often revolved around these topics. An interesting fact, by the way, Steve's IQ is 60, which is quite low, as the average IQ of human being is between 90 and 109. But unlike his IQ, Barker's height was really impressive, 193 centimeters. And Tracy Connolly really liked that. That's probably why she stopped paying attention to his IQ. Incidentally, along with Barker, his brother Jason Owen. His real name is Barker, but Jason changed it, according to one version, after some family quarrels, and according to another, after the incident with baby Peter, began to visit the house where Tracy lived.
and later settled there. Jason was no better than Steven. Each of them said that it was his brother's fault that he had suffered as a child. Steven claimed that Jason had abused him to gain a dominant position in the family, and Jason said that it was Steven who had done it. However, there is a well-known case involving both brothers and as partners. It was back in 1995. Steven and Jason were accused of attacking 92-year-old Hilda Barker, their grandmother, who lived in a bungalow in the seaside town of Whitstable, Kent. The terrified woman told police that her grandchildren had locked her in a cupboard and demanded that she change her will. Steven and Jason wanted them to be named as heirs to the property and funds. But they did not stop there. According to the old woman's neighbors, the brothers put on Guy Fawkes-style mask and terrorized her. Mrs. Barker's neighbor, 58-year-old Jacqueline Cole.
Hilda was bruised every time they came. She was terrified every time they came. Hilda was black and blue when they were here. I don't know what they did. She would never say. She always said, "I fell."
Hilda Barker was soon moved to a nursing home. She died of pneumonia a few months later. But Steven and Jason were never brought to justice for what they did to their grandmother for the sake of their inheritance. All charges became moot after their grandmother's death, although many people familiar with the situation believe the boys should have been charged with manslaughter. What else can be said about Jason Owen? There is not much information about him, but here's an additional detail that will help you understand the kind of person he is. He was once on the police radar for thefts and arson. So in 2006 there were 3 adults in the house where little Peter and 3 other girls, Tracy's daughter, lived. That was 25-year-old Tracy Connolly herself, her boyfriend 31-year-old Steven Barker, and his brother 35-year-old Jason Owen. Tracy's house was already untidy and uncomfortable. But when the people started visiting, and later when 2 more untidy adult men moved in, the situation only got worse. But in reality, dirt and disorder are nothing compared to what happened to Peter Connolly's life. On December 11, 2006, 9-month-old Peter was first admitted to hospital with serious injuries for a baby, bruises on his head, nose, chest, and right shoulder. The doctor who examined the child concluded that these were definitely not accidental injuries. The case then went further, and on 19 December, Tracy Connolly was arrested. She was suspected of child abuse, and although the mother denied all allegations, on 22 December, Peter was placed on a Haringey Child Protection Register for physical abuse and neglect. This meant that social services, whose job it is to look after children unfamiliar with, shall we say, dubious reputation, got involved. For a while, little Peter was in the care of a friend of the family. But as I understand it, having found no direct evidence of his mother's guilt, he was returned to Tracy after 5 weeks. Incidentally, social services tried to establish whether Tracy had a relationship with Barker, as it was obvious that he visited her home. But the woman denied everything. She said she and Steve were just friends. She emphasized this because if she told the truth, she risked losing financial support from the government. For a while, the case went quiet. But on 9 April 2007, Tracy Connolly was back on the doorstep of North Middlesex Hospital with Peter. The doctors found fresh bruises on the boy's body, a black eye, so black that his face was blackened, and swelling on the left side of his head. Again, the same procedure. Tracy is asked what happened, and she denies all accusations, saying only that the child was injured accidentally, that he might have fallen or fought with another child. Then social workers come to Tracy and Peter's home several times, on both announced and unannounced visits. And although they can see that the boy is clearly not well, each time the child is covered in bruises, abrasions and scratches, nothing much changes. Tracy is asked some questions, she answered them somehow, some wrappers are filled in, and that's it. Peter continues to stay in that house, under the care of the same people. One day, after another bruise on the baby's body, social workers instructed a friend of the Connolly family to watch the mother and to take care of her young son. And that was it. No further supervision. They just took their family friend's word that he would do it. Meanwhile, Steve's brothers Owen and his 15-year-old girlfriend moved into the house. The latter, incidentally, was wanted because she went underage and has disappeared. Since then, things have got worse for Peter. While social services went back and forth and doctors recorded injuries on the child's body day after day, behind the closed door of the home where Peter was forced to stay, he was being abused. Stephen Barker did it directly. He could push the body, hit him, and bruise his head. It seems that the more little Peter cried, the more pleasure Barker got. As well as children and adults, there were several large dogs in the house, such as Rottweilers. Some sources say there were 2 of them, others 3. But it doesn't really matter. The fact is that no one checked to see if the animals attacked Peter. And they did. I don't know whether they did it out of aggression or because they were playing. Either way, the baby's head became something of a toy of them, something they could grab with their teeth or just knock to the ground with their big paws. When Owen and the girl moved in, the abuse not only did not stop, it got worse. There is a little evidence of what this man did. A few details have been made public, but it is known that he took little Peter by the legs and spun him around. The child sobbed at this point. It was no fun for him, but it was not just physical abuse. There was also psychological violence in the house. Stephen, who was obsessed with Nazism, taught Peter to greet the family in proper way, by waving his hand from his heart to the sun. If the boy disobeyed or failed to do what Barker ordered, the man would throw the child toys onto the roof, and Peter would be genuinely sad, like any child his age for whom toys are whole world. But the farther he went, the worse it got. One day Stephen Barker decided that the boy could and should be trained like a dog. In particular, he wanted the child to respond to the sound of 2 fingers clicking and to sit on the floor when he heard it. A kind of analog of the sit common for the 4-legged animals. But this was a child who was barely 2 years old. When the social worker knocked on the door of the unhappy home again on 30 July, Tracy was not at a loss. She saw her son's condition and knew the same question would be asked again and she could be in trouble. So the grieving mother smeared chocolate on Peter's face and hands and applied antibacterial cream to his scalp. This was how she hid the next traces of physical abuse. What did the social worker write in his report that day? Take 3 guesses, or better yet, just one. He noted that the boy looked healthy and happy. But can a child with broken ribs look like that? This is the kind of injury rapists have turned to. Jason Owen's 15-year-old girlfriend saw Peter being abused with her own eyes. Here is what she said.
Steve laughed when he hit little Peter. He was so angry. He was doing terrible things to him and recording it on his mobile phone. Peter was crying and screaming, but Steve was just laughing at him. He was making me sick, but I was too scared to stop him.
But after the broken ribs, it was his spine's turn.
He, Steve Barker, was sitting on the couch smiling, smoking marijuana and playing with baby P like a rag doll. Then suddenly I heard a loud crack that echoed throughout the house as the baby's little spine snapped in half.
It is not known exactly how this happened, but it is believed that Stephen Barker lifted Peter up and then abruptly lowered, slamming his back into his knee. 1st August 2007. It was the day that could have been the end of the child's abuse. His injuries were so obviously caused by someone else that it was almost impossible to deny it. And it was on 1st August 2007 when Peter Connolly was examined by a doctor. Let me emphasize, this is a professional, work in the field of pediatrics with the appropriate diploma, skills and work permit. This is not someone off the street. At St. Anne's Hospital in North London, the boy was seen by Sabah Al-Zayari, and she didn't notice anything unusual. She did not note any fractures, even though there were already some. This would later be confirmed by an autopsy. In fact, the doctor simply did not carry out any examination. She noted that the young patient had bruises on his face, but did nothing further because he was, and I quote, unpleasant and moody. Indeed, why should a child be moody when his ribs and spine are broken? Peter returned to his home Hell, and that day, 1st August 2007, was the last time the child saw the world outside his home. On the 2nd of August, Peter was hit in the face. His tooth was knocked out. And the next day, 3rd August 2007, at 11:35 a.m., Tracy Connolly called 999. She said her son was not breathing. The paramedics who arrived saw little Peter in his cot. He was blue and wearing only a nappy. After attempts to resuscitate him, he and his mother were taken to North Middlesex Hospital. Peter could not be saved. At 12:20 p.m., doctors pronounced him dead. However, doctors eventually recorded broken ribs, a fractured spine and Peter's mangled fingertips, which were notably devoid of nails. Experts later found a broken tooth in the child's stomach. The same one had been lost in the final fatal blow. When Tracy heard that Peter was gone, she fell to the hospital floor and cried out in tears,
God, don't take my little boy away from me. I've been waiting for him for so long.
Tracy Connolly was arrested on the same day. When the police entered the house where the so-called family lived, they were shocked by what they saw. Inside it was unbelievably filthy and smelled like a stable that hadn't been cleaned in months. There was dog feces on the floor, rubbish strewn everywhere, dead rats, fleas, bed bugs. Meanwhile, Stephen Barker escaped with Jason Owen and his 15-year-old girl. The trio hid out at the Depton House Center campsite. It is believed that Barker fled to bury a mobile phone in the woods with evidence of Peter's abuse. The police put all three in a wanted list. And when the campground managers discovered that Stephen was not paying for his accommodation, they called him in. The man was openly nervous and they realized something was wrong. And when they heard the police report that the man who looked like a one sitting in front of them was wanted, it didn't take the managers long to put 2 + 2 together. In the end, both Steve and Jason were arrested and charged. Tracy Connolly denied all the charges against her. She only pleaded guilty in the final minutes of the trial. She was charged with causing or permitting the death of a child. The court sentenced her to an indefinite term of imprisonment, with a minimum of 5 years, until she is deemed no longer to be a danger to society and in particular to young children. Incidentally, Tracy was pregnant with Steve Barker's child at the time of Peter's abuse. She later gave birth to a child with him in prison. Steve Barker was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his part in the death of a baby Peter. Like Tracy, he was charged with causing or permitting the death of a child. Jason Owen was sentenced under the same article to an indeterminate term with a minimum of 3 years, but he later appealed and was instead given a fixed term of 6 years. As you can see, none of them were punished for the murder of baby Peter. On 7 July 2022, Connolly was released on parole. At the time, the woman complained that she feared for her life. The 40-year-old bereaved mother was given restrictions on her movements, activities and contacts, as well as 20 other conditions of her license. These included living in a specified address, wearing an electronic bracelet, observing a curfew, etc. Owen and Baker are still in prison. Owen was even released on parole, but violated the conditions. Barker was denied that luxury, especially as he was also on trial for the rape of a 2-year-old girl. Unfortunately, or fortunately, neither I nor the press have any details of this case. It is a delicate and sensitive case. The doctor who failed to notice that Peter's ribs and spine were broken was also responsible. The General Medical Council has banned Dr. Al-Zayati from working without supervision for 18 months. Another issue is the work of social workers. The fact is that Tottenham, where the tragedy occurred, is part of Hertfordshire, and it was Hertfordshire Council, the local authorities, that were at the epicenter of the similar scandal and tragedy. We're talking about the case of Victoria Grimey. She was an 8-year-old girl who was tortured and killed by her carers in 2000. After the death of Peter Connolly, the council itself was heavily criticized for having a significant impact of the work in the child protection department. Firstly, after the Grimey case, the department quickly recruited a large number of new staff to fill the gaps identified during the Grimey investigation. Secondly, the people working in the department were physically exhausted because there was a lot of work but not enough staff. One of the senior child protection workers in Grimey recalls the atmosphere when she joined the team shortly after the Grimey case.
Morale was extremely low. The quality of the staff was very low. People were depressed. To give you an idea of the mood, the cafe across the street was not serving social workers.
The recruitment process did not help either, according to social workers who wished to remain anonymous.
After Grimey, they were desperate for staff. They went to South Africa and Zimbabwe to look for them, where they recruited people from different cultures.
Then, she says, they faced the challenge of managing people with different cultural norms and expectations about bringing up children. She also believed that the new staff had a slightly different motivation for their work. It was less about child protection and more about the right to work in London, save money and send it home. Of course, they are not the only reason why both the Child Protection Unit and the Council of the City of London functioned as they did. But even what I have listed gives an idea of how many negative factors combine to become the fatal for little Peter, and how devastating human indifference can be. The second case I'm going to talk about is different from the first. It's not about indifference. It is about the boundless arrogance of a man and the fear and stigmatization of the victims of a rapist. Lisa was 13 when she started communicating with the rapper Grimey Dee on Instagram. He, the musician, seems to have made the first move. First, a request for surveillance, then a few innocent messages, just to talk and keep dialogue going. And there seems to be nothing wrong with that, except for one nuance. Grimey Dee was long since an adult, while Lisa was only 13. Time passed, and gradually the correspondence between the two users on the social network ceased to be purely friendly. There was more and more flirting, ambiguous hints, and outright sympathy. Word for word, compliment for compliment, day after day, and now the trusting Lizzie is walking to the Grimey Dee's house in trashy clothes, near Wall Street, Haggerston. I don't know the details of this meeting, but one thing for sure, it wasn't the girl's last visit to the rapper's home. And when Lizzie visited Grimey Dee for the second time, the meeting was not just about talking. The man had sex with the teenager, but this meeting was not the last. When Lizzie came to Grimey Dee's house again with a friend, also underage, a 14-year-old girl, he had sex with both of them. But he didn't just have sex with them. The rapper also filmed the whole thing and kept it at home.
I actually made up the name Lizzie. I do not know the real name of the girl who fell into the hands of a London pedophile. Because of the age and sensitivity of the case, not all the names of the victims are published, nor are their faces. And sadly, Lizzie's name is the only fiction in this story.
Grimey Dee, aka Daniel Rodriguez, is a gangsta rapper with a big future, or so he thought. More than a decade ago, this guy wrote music that he liked, and he probably believed that it would soon be enjoyed by millions of listeners. In his simple music videos, he rapped in the company of half-naked girls and other guys, supposedly from his gang. A small black goatee, braided hair, baggy clothes and a cap. These are the attributes that should once again emphasize to the audience that they are looking at the rising rap star. Yes, he doesn't have a label, but that didn't stop him from releasing a full album in 2011 called Dark Philosophies. It included songs like Pleasing My Feelings, I Was Wrong, Enter the Darkness, and Misunderstood. Today, however, you can only find the re-uploads of Grimey Dee's tracks and videos on YouTube. They don't have millions or even hundreds of thousands of views, and instead of the desired thousand of positive comments, there are only a few, and even those are reduced to the short word pedophile. So, how did a gangster rapper with his own album and a couple of music videos become someone who is usually locked up in the modern world? The story began in 2012. Daniel Rodriguez was 24 years old, and although he had big ambitions and bragged about what a cool rap artist he was, Daniel's life was rather unremarkable. He had no job. The self-proclaimed rap star lived in the same house as his mother and sister. The rapper was an active user of social media, and that is understandable. If you want to become mega popular, you have to use every platform to promote yourself and your work. But Grimey Dee was special. Unlike many other stars, he managed his own social media. And not just any social media. Grimey Dee himself subscribed to and added as friends those whose profiles interested him. Among the people, Grimey Dee started communicating with weird girls, and it seems that is not surprising. A young rapper wants attention. That's normal. I agree it would be perfectly normal if there were not one nuance. He was communicating with girls who were under the age of consent. They were schoolgirls of 13, 14, 15 years old. What did they talk about with an adult rapper who had been an adult for years? Different things, really. But Daniel Rodriguez was particularly fond of complimenting the girl and later telling them how much he loved them. But he did not stop there. Following his confession of first sympathy and then love, he sent message that essentially boiled down to one thing. Grimey Dee was inviting his online girlfriends to his home. Yes, it was the same scheme that brought the 13-year-old girl with the fictitious name Lizzie, who I mentioned at the beginning of the story, into the rapper's web. Between 2012 and 2015, Grimey Dee sent out 10,000 friends or follow requests on Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp and BlackBerry Messenger, looking for those who would agree to just talk and then come to his house. In the end, he got about 100 responses, and at least 7 girls fell for the celebrity hook. Although, celebrity? Let me remind you, Rodriguez lived with his mother and sister in a small house and was unemployed. So the gangsta rapper image he built up around himself was more for an exaggerated fake. A fake that allowed him to impress naive, trusting young girls. Perhaps Rodriguez would still be looking for underage girls to lure into sex, but a banal coincidence worked against him. In 2015, the police were conducting an investigation that had nothing to do with what Rodriguez was doing. As a part of the investigation, the police seized the mobile phone of a 14-year-old girl, the one with the fictitious name Lizzie. They studied the contents apparently to find the evidence they needed in one of the cases, and came across the minor's correspondence with the Grimey Dee, the same Rodriguez. The police reread the messages and realized that the girl had probably had sexual contact with a man much older than her. This led to a more in-depth interview with the teenager and later to a search warrant for the house where Rodriguez lived. And what was found inside shocked even experienced detectives. Police seized Rodriguez's BlackBerry phone and several USB drives. Among other things, the drives contained several videos. These were recordings of Rodriguez have sex with minors. In one case, for example, it was a 14-year-old girl who came in Grimey Dee's house in a school uniform. In general, the police concluded from the evidence that Rodriguez had sex with 4 victims. 3 of the girls were 14 and 1 was 15. They also found photographs of an intimate nature involving minors. Police arrested Rodriguez after investigation revealed that the serial pedophile was walking free in London. It happened in August 2015. Detective Constable John Knox, who led the investigation, said,
Rodriguez is a dangerous and predatory pedophile who preys on young, vulnerable girls. He played on his image as a gangster rapper, and his victims were afraid of him and believed they would be hurt if they spoke to anyone in authority. The girls were frightened by this and worried about the possible consequences because of his gangster rap image,
said Detective Constable John Knox, who led the investigation. Grimey Dee, of course, hired a lawyer, although it was obvious he would not get away with it. The evidence was too overwhelming and the gangster rapper had collected it himself. During the investigation, the police also discovered that the teenagers had been forced to comply with the so-called rap star's demands, even though it was humiliating for them. But none of the girls dared go to the police for fear of being judged and blamed. Prosecutor Edward Lucas said Daniel Rodriguez uses his experience, charm, cunning, and ultimately his power, the power of his personality, to indulge his own perverting acts. And Judge Joanna Greenberg said Rodriguez deliberately targeted vulnerable and sensitive young girls to fulfill his deviant sexual fantasies. Grimey Dee's lawyer, Charles Evans, said his client certainly did not realize the gravity of what he was doing and was absolutely stunned when he learned the seriousness of the crimes. This sounds ludicrous to say the least. However, in order not to make value judgments, after all, I did not attend the court hearings and have not seen the case file, I will quote Judge Greenberg, who studied all the facts and evidence and saw Rodriguez in person.
He must be blind and live like a hermit,
said the judge, explaining that it's simply impossible to miss news of such cases involving celebrities. So to suggest that Rodriguez did not know how serious a crime he was committed is, at the very least, strange.
You couldn't help but know how seriously the sexual exploitation of children is taken,
she said. Eventually, Grimey Dee repented, but it didn't help him. Judge Greenberg summed up the case this way.
Many victims of such crimes experience a lifetime of humiliation and shame. You pose a significant risk and could cause serious psychological harm to young girls. Your expressions of remorse ring hollow,
said Judge Joanna Greenberg. Rodriguez was convicted of several charges: sexual acts committed against a child, creation of incident photographs, sexual assault, attempting to force a girl to participate in sexual activities, incitement of a child to sexual activity. The 28-year-old rapper was imprisoned for 16 years. The sentence was handed down in July 2016 in the Wood Green Crown Court. Speaking after the sentencing, Superintendent Detective John McDonald said he was pleased with the jail term. He said such an outcome sent a strong message to those who sexually abuse children. But Detective John Knox, who worked on the case, said the victims in this case may not be the only ones. There are likely to be other girls who have suffered as a result of Daniel Rodriguez's actions. The detective urged girls not to keep quiet.
If you believe you have been contacted by Rodriguez, I urge you to contact the police,
said Detective John Knox. That call was made in 2016, but as far as I know, no new victims came forward until 2024. The third story is about a woman who became the queen of a gang of armed bank robbers. She was motivated to do this by the murder of her first husband, who was shot by the police, and she decided to take revenge in this way. But she became more famous when she shot her second husband, firing a bullet while holding the gun to his head. And strangely enough, all of her husband did not end well. It is thought that this is why she was nicknamed by the Black Widow. I'm talking about the criminal called Linda Calloway. Linda, whose maiden name was Welford, was born in 1948. She grew up in the East London district of Stepney Green. I'm not from London myself, but it's said that this area is a working-class gathering place, sort of place where London's cockneys live, eat jelly and use slang. But to simplify for the sake of general understanding, there was simply not the poorest people in the country. According to the Linda herself, her childhood was quite happy, even though her family, unlike many around her, was not wealthy. Crime was the order of the day in Linda's youth, although she herself noted that she had never personally experienced it. She just believed what her parents said, and they assured her that the streets were dangerous. Linda still convinced everyone that she led an honest life, working as a receptionist on a paint factory, and that she never thought she would ever enter criminal circles. But one decision changed her life forever. One day, a relative invited Linda to a party, but it was no ordinary party. It was dedicated to the fact that a man called Mickey Calvi had been released from prison. According to one version, he had been released from prison altogether. According to another, it had been a short holiday, as Calvi had been allowed to visit his family and friends for a short period until the end of his 8-year sentence. Yes, that's right, 8 years for armed robbery as a part of a gang. Why did Mickey get involved? It's simple, he wanted a better life like many other gangsters in the neighborhood. Whether he get out for a short time or forever doesn't really matter. What matters is something else. Linda didn't want to go to the party at first. At 22, she had seen more than one film and read more than one article about the underworld. In popular culture, people who had been in prison were always portrayed as extremely ugly. She had no interest in such a company. But after some persuasion from a relative, Linda agreed to go. They persuaded her that it was just for one night, that she shouldn't take it too seriously, that Linda would have nothing to do with this Mickey after that. But things didn't work out as expected. Linda fell in love with Mickey Calvi. When they met, the man captivated her with his charisma and beauty. Yes, I said man for a reason. Mickey Calvi was 17 years older than Linda. In other words, he was already 39 when he met his future wife.
For me, he was gorgeous, beautiful, and I just lost my mind over him,
says Linda. Later, many years later, when Linda had reached the age when she could call a woman of respectable age, she answered the question, "If you could change one thing in your life, what would it be?" She will say,
"Don't go to that party. How would things have turned out? I hope it would have been a completely different life."
For this 22-year-old girl from East London neighborhood, it was indeed a life-changing meeting. Linda and Mickey were soon married. His charisma won over not only her but also her parents. In the end, they hoped he'd get his act together after his release from prison, but he didn't. Mickey never hid from Linda what he had done, was doing, and what would do. With his friends, he robbed banks, post office and special vans, usually used to take money out of banks. Mickey used to tell Linda,
I want to have a lot of cool stuff, and the only way for people like me to get it is to become a robber.
This vision was allegedly driven by the poverty he experienced as a child and the fact that his family did not love him. Linda recalled that when Mickey said a phrase like, "I'm going to work on Friday," it meant, "I'm going to rob." It became so commonplace for her that Mickey's gang would end up meeting at her house, and while the men worked on their criminal plan, Linda would make them sandwiches and tea. But her role soon became more important. Linda Calvi became her husband's driver and eventually took up arms herself, participating in the robberies from the inside, as it were being in the middle of the action. The couple had 2 children, 4 years apart, but the family's life of crime was not to last for years. On 9 December 1978, Mickey Calvin was shot dead by a London Metropolitan Police officer during another robbery. The official coroner's report said Sergeant Michael Banks shot Mickey in the stomach as he tried to flee with a loaded gun. But Linda categorically rejects this version. She assures us that her husband did not load his gun that morning. He said that he did not want to kill anyone and that he only took the gun to frighten people with the sound of a gunshot in case of an emergency. Linda insisted, and still insists, that Mickey was shot from behind, not from the front, meaning that the policeman's life was not in danger and he had no right to open fire on Mickey. The woman even allegedly ordered an additional investigation, the results of which backed up her words, but the data was never made public. Linda vowed to avenge her husband's murder. She stated that, quote,
"Mickey died trying to give us everything. When he was lying in the open coffin, I held his toes and said, 'I'm going to take revenge by continuing your work.' I guess when Mickey died, it sounds strange, and I don't know. I've always said that when they told me he was shot, something happened to my brain because I decided I had to avenge my husband, because they had done this to him. So I decided to become a bank robber and do what he did."
Linda Calvi. Incidentally, one of the reasons why Linda Calvi is called the Black Widow is that she did not take off her black clothes for a very long time after Mickey's death. However, before Linda Calvi became involved in a life of a crime, she was, let's say, under the influence and tutelage of Ron Cook for some time. He's a member of a gangster group and Mickey's associate. It was Cook who allegedly first gave Linda money to live on, and it was with him that Linda began a relationship, although the man is said to have had a wife and children at the time.
"He bought me a ring and said I was his. I said, 'No, I don't.' He replied, 'Your son is such a good boy.' Then I realized that his words meant nothing more than that he would do anything to my son. That's how I got stuck in the relationship with Cook."
Linda Calvi. Linda was saved, strangely enough, by the justice system. Ron Cook was caught and sentenced to 16 years in prison for taking part in an armed robbery. The woman continued to visit Cook in prison, but this time she decided to build her own criminal career. And from the possession of a gangster's widow, she became a gang boss. With other gangsters, Linda did the same thing as her late husband, robbing banks, post office and cars carrying money and jewelry. In 2002, Linda claimed to have made £1 million from the robberies. Here's what she said.
"I loved picking up a gun, confronting men in armored cars, and forcing them to hand over large sums of money."
Linda Calvi. The woman later explained that the case had actually started as revenge from Mickey, but the armed robbery had become their way of life, the norm. As the boss, Linda always offered to share the loot equally, no matter how many people were involved in the criminal operation, but all her male colleagues said,
You're a girl. We should give you a bigger share.
I don't know how the money was finally divided, but Linda herself said that this behavior of the gangsters seemed strange to her and she didn't quite understand why they did it. But if Calvi can be described as a skilled burglar with a gun and an authoritative leader, the word elusive is definitely not the right one. In 1986, her gang was caught trying to rob a post office in Stepney Green, and Linda was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Investigators found that the Calvi gang not only made death threats and robbed institutions where there was money, they also sprayed dangerous ammonia in the same post office where staff and customers were based. Sentencing Linda, the judge said,
This is an unbelievably appalling case. It is probably
The worst case ever heard in a British court. These robberies were carefully planned and organized, carried out with skill, efficiency, and ruthlessness.
Linda Calvin was sent to Hollow Prison to serve her sentence, the longest sentence in the prison. But was it hard for this woman to live in prison? Let's just say her stay there wasn't the worst. All because of what Linda did and her unique case. Calvi later admitted that she was lucky because during her first imprisonment, those involved in armed robberies were at the top of prison hierarchy. And during her time in prison, she saw many women convicted of various crimes: assault, murder, drug trafficking, but she never met a single woman who led a gang that made money from armed robbery.
It was like, wow, she's an armed robber. And that was kind of my doobie. All the girls respected me,
says Linda Calvi. Linda served about 3 years in prison and was released on parole. Then she decided no more crimes. But 18 months later she found herself back in the dock, this time for a murder that took place in her own home. The story of how this happened is extremely eerie, sometimes contradictory, confusing and, as Linda herself said, ambiguous. Judge for yourself. While Ron Cook was behind bar, Linda Calvi did not sit idly by. As well as running as a gang, she began to organize her personal life. Linda began an affair with Brian Terhune and then with Daniel Reese. Both are underworld figures. Thorogood is a friend of Ron Cook and Reese is a friend of Thorogood. In addition, as the prosecutor argued in this case, Linda was supposed to keep the money left to her by Ron Cook. However, this did not work out. She spent a considerable amount of her thieving partner's fortune. The situation was clearly become tense and Cook was about to be released, so he would quickly realize what the real situation was. Some of his money was gone, and on top of that, the woman he thought was his was cheating on him with 2 lovers while he was in prison. Linda Calvi decided to take radical action. She paid Daniel Reese £10,000 to kill Ron Cook. All this was to happen when the prisoner crossed the threshold of the house where Calvi lived. But just as everything was about to happen, the plan went awry. Reese seemed to get cold feet and failed to kill Cook. He ended up putting a bullet in his own arm. When Linda realized that things were going badly for her, she pointed the gun at Cook and shouted,
"Get on your knees!"
Then a shot was fired. The police, who soon arrived on the scene, found Ron Cook dead. He had suffered horrific head wounds and a broken neck from a point-blank gunshot. Linda Calvi was arrested, but the accused has a very different version of events. The woman claims she did not spend Cook's money and has suffered for years because of him. She did have an affair with Thorogood, but only because she showed her concern. She also had an affair with Reese, but at first they were friends. Linda helped Reese not to feel lonely because he has lost his son while in prison for armed robbery. When Cook was released, it was Reese who shot him, Linda says. He did it to protect Linda from Cook's abuse and to take revenge for the failed robbery that killed Mickey, the gangster assured him.
Reese knew that on the day the love of her life died, everything was far from clear, and that Mickey's death was due in no small part to Cook's actions. And that seems to be why Linda decided not to tell the police about the real killer, probably out of gratitude or shock. At first, she told the legend that Cook had been shot by a stranger, but eventually she changed her story and accused Reese of the murder.
According to the woman, the police checked to see if there were any marks on her body that would indicate Linda had used a gun that day. They found nothing. But when they found out who she was and what her background was, they arrested her anyway and framed her for the murder. Eventually, Reese and Calvi were jailed for Cook's murder in 1991, but the lovers were not at a loss. They soon decided to get married in prison. Linda said her mother begged her not to, but she decided to do it her way because
it was the most exciting thing that had happened in her prison cell for a long time.
How did Linda Calvi live during her second imprisonment? At least it was no worse than anyone else's. She claimed that she was in a cell with women she had met before in prison. As a result, she was never harassed, but rather respected. But the prison marriage was not the last. When Linda was released in 2008, she divorced Reese. The reason was that while she was still serving her sentence and officially married to the offender, she met a billionaire called George Caesar. Their path crossed in a restaurant when Linda was granted a one-day furlough, the right to be free for 24 hours. Linda captivated Caesar at first sight, and he eventually proposed to her. The couple married in a small village church in 2009. What happened to Reese? As with Linda's previous partner, nothing good happened, although I haven't found any details. All I know is that he spent some time in and out of prison. Linda, on the other hand, probably lived her best life during these years, in the luxury she had dreamed of since childhood.
When I was little, I saw a woman in a fur coat sitting in a Rolls Royce. I looked at her and thought, one day I will have a fur coat and a car like that. Ironically, it wasn't until I met my last husband that I got a Rolls Royce, although I had a lot of fur before that.
Says Linda Calvi. Linda also survived her third husband, George Caesar. He died of cancer in 2015. According to Linda, as Caesar was dying, he allegedly told her,
You always wanted to write. Others have written so much about your life. Take it into your own hands and write your own story properly.
That's how Linda's Calvi book, Black Widow, the story of her life, was born. To this day, the woman maintained that she did not kill Ron Cook and that she is a victim of police brutality and prejudice. However, she is not happy that she ever became involved in crime.
Looking back at myself in the past, I can say that I don't recognize the person I used to be. I really don't recognize it. It's something very foreign to me. I'm really shocked that I'm the person who did all those things. I am very sorry.
Says Linda Calvi. The woman insists that staying in prison is a waste of time and that the money she has made from crime is not worth it.
There is nothing good in going to prison. There is nothing. It is a waste of life. And when people ask me if it's worth it, I can say, maybe 5%, which means the other 95% is just a waste of life and time. And it's very sad.
Linda Calvi. Linda Calvi is now 76-year-old. She is the mother of 2 grown-up children in their 40s, the grandmother of 7 grandchildren, and the great-grandmother of 5. She lives in a 400-year-old cottage bought for her by her late third husband and said she no longer has anything to do with crime. But I saved one interesting detail for the end of the story. Charles Bronson, considered Britain's most violent criminal, wrote a kind of dedication to Calvi in 1995, saying she was a real lady, a real East London girl. Other criminals did not receive such dedications from him. Well, thank you for watching or listening this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you would like more stories like this or know any interesting cases that I should tell you about, please leave a comment. See you later.